The Roman Empire, 6th century AD. Throughout history, humans' innate fear of the oceans and what they hold beneath them has captivated our minds and made us wonder what type of monsters and beasts lurk deep underneath Earth's waters. Legends and stories like the Kraken, the era of the Megalodon, and even Moby Dick, just to name a few. However, some of these stories and monsters seem, by all definitions, more than a legend, or more than a story, but also not fully understood by modern science. During the Byzantine era of the Roman Empire, shipping vessels throughout the Black Sea were at risk of being attacked by a giant sea beast, a whale of gigantic proportions that was known by all in the area. Merchant boats, fishing vessels, and even military warships feared this massive whale, who was supposedly purple in color. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we turn back the history books to examine this dated legend and story to figure out what could be responsible for the massive ship-capsizing whale known as Porphryios. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic. And if you were listening to this show on YouTube or Spotify, I first want to say thank you, and I appreciate you taking a listen and finding me on either one of those outlets. If you are listening to me on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. If you like my content, I appreciate the support. It helps me out a lot, and I greatly appreciate it. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you like this content, also feel free to drop a comment. Like I said, let me know. You can also shoot me an Instagram direct message. You can also find me at my email, where you can also send me topic suggestions as well. People who've been listening to this show for a very, very long time know that I do take topic suggestions, and I am very active in doing them, and they help me out a lot when you actually send me topic suggestions. So please send them my way, and you can send them to my email, which is unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. With all those mandatory plugs out of the way, I want to welcome you all back again to Season 3. Now, I have had a crazy couple of weeks here with trying to get those first few episodes out for Season 3, and then I had to leave on a vacation, or I shouldn't say I had to leave, but I went on vacation, and that kind of left my schedule all kind of out of sorts and out of whack, and left me in a hole to start this season, maybe behind the 8 ball. And between that and my work schedule starting to fill up, I am trying my best to make sure I carve out some time to make sure I am getting content out for you all as best as I possibly can. And today I have a very interesting topic, and when I stumbled upon this story, I thought it was such a good little palate cleanser for you all who've listened to now a couple unsolved murder mysteries to start this new Season 3. So for today's episode, of course, I wanted to do something different, and I found this story for you all. Now, I very seldomly dived into the world of sea monster stories, or I have very seldomly dived into this realm of stories and legends, and very little of them have been from kind of the deep roots of history. I haven't done a whole lot that are kind of very old school in terms of their origins, and maybe that's for a couple different reasons, but I've kind of only grazed over those in the past, and like I said, I found this story and it really compelled me and it intrigued me because it seemed very well documented, as opposed to some other old-fashioned monster stories that you might have heard before. However, we will dive into the story as a whole. We will also dive into the details of the monster in question, and perhaps some of the uncertainties that do exist with this story, with it being all the way from 6th century AD. So with that being said, how today's episode is going to go today is that I'm going to give you a brief history lesson on where this story takes place, and that is in the Byzantine era of the late Roman Empire. And then we will talk about Porphryios the whale and the documented history behind him or she. And then we will discuss some modern day theories for what Porphryios could have been, and then I will wrap it up with my own personal thoughts and theories on the story as a whole. So with that all being said, let's open up our history books. Let's dive into history class real quick with a recap on the Byzantine Empire and the Romans. Now, you might have heard of both of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. However, you might have thought that they were either two separate things, or you didn't know the relation between the two and with each other. Now, again, I am not a history major by any way, shape, or form. However, I kind of condense this as much as I can, and I hope I got all my information correct. Now, in a sense, the Byzantine Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire. In 330 AD, Roman Emperor Constantine I would decide to take it upon himself to form a new city at the ancient Greek site known as Byzantium. Constantine I would want this to be a quote-unquote new Rome and relocate the capital of the Roman Empire to this spot. Of course, Byzantium would not remain the name of this city, as this city would evolve and change and adopt the name Constantinople, which is now known as Istanbul in modern times within the country of Turkey. Now, with Constantine I deciding to move the capital of the Roman Empire to this spot, it would pose significant advantages to the empire through defensive capabilities. Where the city was along the Golden Horn Inlet, it means that the Roman Empire could fortify it and defend it very well. And when the Theodosian walls were erected in 410 through 413 AD, the city was now easily defendable from land and sea attacks. Also, Constantinople provided advantages for trading as well, as it almost acted like a bridge between Europe and Asia, and anyone wanting to go and trade into Europe by way of sea would have to go through the Bosphorus Strait, which the city could now kind of control. Now, when this happened and Constantinople was established as this new grand city, the Romans to the west, still in the quote-unquote original portion of the Roman Empire, they would be separate but united under Constantine I's ruling. However, when Constantine I would die in 337, the two would slowly drift apart from one another and kind of act almost like separate nations rather than the same empire. This would fully be put into motion when in 364, then Emperor Valentinian I would separate the two sides into almost city-states, with him ruling over the east side with Constantinople and his brother Valens ruling over the western side that still had Rome and other large portions of Europe. Now, as time went on, the two sides kept drifting apart. The western side was under constant attack by neighboring empires and countries, most notably the Germans, and eventually, the western side of the Roman Empire kept losing more and more territory until only Italy remained. Then, in 476, I'm going to so butcher this, and I so apologize, Odoacer? I'm going to say Odoacer. If that is incorrect, please feel free to let me know in the comment section. That is a tricky one. There is vowels in places there should not be vowels. Odoacer, who is a warrior and barbarian, overthrew the Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustus, and the original Roman Empire was then disbanded, and Italy eventually went on to become its own country. Now, while the West Roman Empire fell, the East and Constantinople flourished and would survive for 12 centuries before ultimately being conquered by the Ottomans in 1453 and becoming then the Ottoman Empire. Now, while the tale of Porphryios the whale does not take us that far in those times in the future, into the 1400s, I felt like it was important to give you that little crash course on the overall history of the Byzantine era, the Byzantine Empire, and the kind of Roman Empire during that time as a whole. Now, what we know about the legend of Porphryios comes from a historian during the 6th century. Now, this would be roughly 200-ish years after the establishment of the Byzantine Empire, so the empire was well established by this point. Now, this historian, whose name was Porphryios, was possibly the most influential scholar during the Roman times of the 6th century, and he happened to speak of Porphyrios in two of his long novels, The History of the Wars and in The Secret History. Now, if you might be thinking that these stories could very well be made up, Procopius, like I mentioned, was a very influential dude. He documented much of the wars to take place during this period and documented then Emperor Justinian I's life in great detail throughout his collection of works and novels. Now, his works are considered extremely important to seeing what life was like during this time period within the Byzantine Empire. Many historians credit his works as being invaluable and extremely important. So, just in case you might think that this was someone who was trying to steal headlines by making up a sea monster story, that is where you might be wrong. Of course, we will discuss all possible theories here in a little bit. However, I want you to know that maybe the fact of this being a hoax is maybe not the case, and instead, maybe something more down to earth, but we'll save that for a little bit later. Now, throughout Procopius's works, he paints a good picture about Porphyrios' appearance and how difficult the whale made life for the residents of Constantinople as well as those who resided on the Black Sea. Procopius would describe the whale as 45 feet in length and 15 feet wide. This would mean that Porphyrios would be similar in size to that of an adult sperm whale. Now, when it comes to the name Porphyrios, no one is certain where the name for the whale came from. As to all accounts, Procopius does not provide that detail in any of his works, so we are now left to speculate. Some historians believe that Porphyrios is simply a mashing together of words to mean purple or purple boy. Now, purple would be a color that many people during this time frame would be familiar with. Purple was a color often associated with royalty, and many people were exposed to the color purple. It was a very common color that people during this era and anybody who encountered royalty would see. Fairly common color, so for them to kind of attribute the color purple to something is not totally unreasonable. Now, some believe that the name Porphyrios could also be a reference to a giant from Greek mythology known as Porphyryon. Now, we don't have a clear answer to the question of where Porphyrios gets his name, but perhaps it did have something to do with the fact that he was described as having this deep purple hue or color to his skin. Now, maybe the name is a reference to both. Maybe it is a reference to the purple skin of Porphyrios. Maybe it is a reference to the giant, the Greek giant Porphyryon, because the whale just happens to be huge, and he also happens to be purple, so it's kind of a convenient meeting point for a name. Maybe. That's just my 2 cents. I'm just merely speculating. Now, also, maybe the name, like I said, is a reference to both, but I also feel like oftentimes us as humans, we find a defining characteristic in a person and then base a nickname around it. Now, I do not feel like that is not uncommon, and if the whale did happen to be purple, it would make sense if they named the whale something like Purple Boy or something like that. Now, Porphyrios, like many other whales during this period of history, were not well understood like they are today. During this time period, they were often viewed as sea monsters because of the few sightings witnesses would have of them and the fact of them being such tremendous sizes. Now, if you were someone during the Middle Ages and you happened to see a whale for the first time, you would also probably think it was a monster too. Now, Porphyrios made his home in the Bosporus Strait in the Black Sea. And while in the Black Sea, Porphyrios would make short work of any sea vessel that he deemed attackable. Now, it is uncertain why he did this. Whether it was just for the love of the game remains unclear, but we know he did this, and Procopius documented it. Now, Porphyrios was not the only whale to attack shipping vessels during this time. However, the rate in which he or she did so made him stand out from the rest. That and the seemingly random nature of these attacks and the idea that no ship was off limits. Now, the fact of this terrified sailors in the area, thinking that the next time they headed out on the open waters, they could be attacked by a monster and meet their demise out on the ocean. Porphyrios' reign of terror over the Eastern Roman Empire and the Byzantines would last over 5 decades, with many unsure how they could put an end to the carnage. The attacks on shipping vessels, warships, and other boats within the Black Sea became such a problem that then Emperor Justinian I had to address the whale's attacks. He stressed that he felt obligated to protect the waters in which the sailors sailed in, and that Porphryios should be vanquished to stop the violence occurring in the Black Sea. However, that was easier said than done, as nobody really had a clear idea on how to either capture or kill Porphryios. Now, the case of whales attacking ships is not a new fad, and during this time, albeit it might have been odd or unusual to us in modern day, now, it is well documented that whales and orcas are extremely smart creatures, and that they sometimes attack boats deliberately. Now, some very famous examples of whales attacking boats would be the case of the Essex, a whaling ship from Nantucket, Massachusetts, that was sunk by a sperm whale in 1820. Now, this story of the Essex being attacked by a sperm whale has been immortalized through the story of Moby Dick, which I can assume everyone has heard of at some point or another. The Anne Alexander, an ammunition vessel and three-masted boat, also from Massachusetts, was also famously attacked and sunk by a sperm whale in 1851. Many instances and reports show that whales seem to have an idea of what they are doing when they attack these boats, as many times the whales will ram the boats repeatedly, showing intent to sink and destroy the boat in question. Now, this phenomenon has continued into modern times, perhaps most notably a current issue going on within the Iberian Peninsula near Spain and Morocco. Now, in this area, they have seen a tremendous spike in orca-related attacks on boats throughout the waters there. Since 2020, when this issue seemingly started, over 600 boats have been hit by orcas in the Iberian Peninsula region, and 5 boats have actually been sunk as a result of these attacks. Of course, modern-day shipbuilding lends itself to be pretty safe when it comes to a possible whale attack. However, it's still the idea that whales are launching attacks against boats and humans for reasons that we don't fully understand. It's kind of a very startling trend and kind of goes to show you that whales are hyper intelligent, and the reason that they are attacking humans kind of seems very strange and very unusual, and of course we don't fully understand it. Perhaps it is simply an evolutionary result of centuries of whaling and overfishing. Perhaps it is merely a defensive and territorial attack. The questions certainly remain. However, we also have plenty of accidental run-ins and accidents of boats colliding with whales as well. So perhaps we have a influenced legend that has been taken and twisted with stories like Moby Dick for whalers and sailors to be scared of whenever they venture out into the high seas. Instances of boats such as the Frederick in 1849, the Pocahontas in 1850, and Union in 1807 all either sank or suffered major damage after inadvertent collisions with whales. We of course know that this is not the case with Porphryios, as it seems like the attacks by this angry purple whale were very sporadic and spiteful. However, that is just some more history and facts for you, just to season you up a little bit for when we get into theories here. When it came to Porphryios, as it turns out, Emperor Justinian I's whale problem with Porphryios would come to a natural end, and not at the hand of some vengeful whale hunter. While chasing some dolphins along the shoreline, Porphryios would manage to beach itself right at the mouth of the Black Sea. Porphryios would struggle and writhe to get itself back in the water, but when it did so, it only sank further into this thick mud that was along the beach. Now, it did not take long for the local townspeople to hear that the legendary purple man-killer of a whale had managed to get itself stuck on the beach, and they were fed up. For 50 years, this whale had terrorized the oceans, and everyone wanted a piece of the revenge pie. The townspeople flocked down to the beach and brought their weapons, axes, and swords, and anything they could, and attacked the beach Porphryios. They hacked and slashed at the hide of Porphryios. However, the blades did little to no damage against this thick hide and blubber of the whale. Once realizing that their weapons were not doing as well as they had hoped, the townspeople left the beach and returned with ropes and wagons to attach to the whale to drag it further away from the water to make sure Porphryios would not manage to get away. Once they tied the whale up and dragged him further onto the beach, the townspeople would start cutting off chunks of flesh from the whale. Now, some people on the beach were ecstatic with the whale finally being captured and killed. However, it is more than likely that the whale was not killed by the townspeople cutting meat off of it, but rather, of course, being beached for that long of a time just killed Porphryios because he stopped breathing. Now, to celebrate this monument occasion, some townspeople took to cutting off large chunks of meat to take home and eat for later and preserve it. And some decided just to flat out eat it raw on the beach, which I absolutely would not do, but to each their own. Now, I have personally never had raw whale meat before, and if anyone has, let me know in the comments. How was it? Was it disgusting? Or was it surprisingly better than you thought? This is a survey that I feel like I need to do, and when I discovered this little fact, I'm like, yeah, I gotta ask my listeners this. Anybody had it? And if it was it bad? Or was it good? Somewhere in the middle? Who knows? I just wanted to ask. Now, after this event, rumors had spread around the Black Sea area and Constantinople that the whale that had beached itself was not in fact Porphryios, but instead a different whale. Now, there is no way to prove whether or not this is the case, but perhaps that is just a rumor that is being made to help add a spin or twist and perpetuate the legend itself. But with all this being said, I think that now brings us on to our theory section, and let's talk really quick about what Porphryios could have been. Now, our first theory is that Porphryios would have been a sperm whale. Now, this seems to be one of the more popular theories to this, and as we discussed a little bit earlier on in the episode, sperm whales have had a tumultuous history, to say the least, when it comes to run-ins and attacks against boats. The size of the whale in question would also match up. The length of the creature being 45 feet long is within average sperm whale size, so that would fit. However, the only question mark here is that sperm whales don't frequent the Black Sea. The Black Sea and the mouth of it is too shallow for sperm whales to reside in. Now, you also have the question of the whale supposedly being purple in color. Of course, sperm whales are not purple, so this would have to be some type of misidentification if you want to buy into the sperm whale theory. Now, our second theory is that this would be an orca, aka a killer whale. Now, this is another one of the popular theories that exists, and that is because orcas frequent the Black Sea and attack boats quite frequently. An orca would also be something that, if encountered in the 6th century by the Byzantine Empire, they probably would have no idea what they'd be looking at. Perhaps the black skin of the orca was mistaken for purple, and that's how the rumors of this being a purple whale spread. Now, it is not overly far-fetched. However, size comes into question. Orcas don't get 45 feet long, and that would be a utterly massive size for an orca to be. Orcas are known to be hyper-aggressive in nature, so everything about Porphryios would match up with an orca. However, again, size is the issue. We don't really get a whole lot of details when it comes to Porphryios from Procopius's writings, and I feel like if we were provided with a few more details on the creature's physical appearance, besides its length and width, we might be able to help better identify what species of whale Porphryios actually was. Now, my last theory, my third and final theory, is that this story was some sort of hoax that was made up to explain a series of boat attacks by some other sea monster of a whale. Now, before I go into this, I know I had just mentioned that I think we should take Procopius's writings literally, and that I don't see a reason for him to lie, and I agree with that. However, that is just my personal opinion, and this is just kind of a last little theory for you if you choose to buy into this one. Now, perhaps Porphryios was a name given to not one whale, but a whole bunch of whales as some type of explanation for boats going missing or boats being attacked by orcas or sperm whales. Now, of course, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, it was not uncommon during this time for all whales to be described and considered as some type of sea monster through the eyes of people living during this time period. They did not fully understand or comprehend marine life that was alongside them at this point. This is further supported by the legend of the Kraken as well. Now, for this to be a totally fabricated story doesn't fully check out with me. Like I said, Procopius seemed to be a reliable historian of this time period, and for him to make up an entire story of this monster whale that was capsizing boats, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Now, when it comes to my personal thoughts, I think that the story of Porphryios was real, and that of course we know that it was a whale, that it's well documented that it was a whale, but the type of whale seems to be hotly debated. Of course, I am not a marine biologist, but if I were to bet, which I don't, because I always lose, I would say that this must have been a very, very, very large orca. Of course, whales in the wild really don't have many natural predators, which would allow them to grow to very large sizes. Now, it does seem a little skeptical that an orca could be that size or get to that size, but maybe the size was slightly exaggerated and off by a touch. That is very possible. It is also very possible that the black skin of the orca could have been misinterpreted as a purple hue due to purple's involvement in undertones in royal life during this time period. Maybe some of these things I might be grasping at eggshells here, but I am merely hypothesizing, as we don't really have a good answer to this sea monster story from the age of the Roman Empire. But again, I think this was a very large orca. I think the behavior would match if it was hyper-aggressive, and sailors probably misinterpreted the color from a black to most likely a purple. But again, that is just my 2 cents. But what do you all think? Feel free to let me know in the comment sections or reach out to me in any place. Instagram, direct message, to my email, comment sections, whatever it may be. Feel free to reach out to me with your own personal thoughts, your own theories too. If you decide that, hey, maybe I think that this was something else, maybe it wasn't a whale, or maybe it was a different type of whale that nobody has considered yet, maybe feel free to let me know. Overall, I think this story is a very interesting one. It kind of gives us a glimpse into kind of the very early sea monster, and I guess if you want to say cryptid too, because I guess maybe cryptid? Maybe that's grouping it into a different category, but a very, very, very early cryptid story, and it is very interesting and very fascinating that it was so kind of well documented throughout these writings. I feel like very much when it comes to sea monster stories, and when you go back in time, and I've heard other content creators talk about this, and I kind of agree with them here, the farther you go back, the less information that is usually available to you, and that is usually out there, and that is usually documented. So when you encounter very old stories of cryptids or monsters or things that go bump in the night, there is very little evidence to go along with them. There is very little correspondence when it comes to these stories. It's kind of one-off instances of somebody saw something and that person told another person, and that person happened to tell somebody who owned a newspaper or whatever it might be. They're very one-off circumstances that are not documented well, and that is kind of the opposite of this. This is a story, again, that takes place in the 6th century AD and was documented by one of the most famous historians during this time period. This whale obviously captivated the people of the Black Sea and Constantinople for 5 decades, and it's very clear that this whale had a significant impact on life in this area. And it's kind of surprising to me that this story does not get talked about more than it probably should be, because I think that this, again, is a very, very fascinating story. And again, I think it is a good palate cleanser from the first 2 episodes that were very true crime and unsolved murder as the topics. So I hope you appreciated this little U-turn for this week's episode. Again, I hope you all appreciate it. And I appreciate you again for tuning into this week's episode. I always appreciate the support. I know I say it every single week, but it does mean a lot to me. And I do apologize for kind of my wonky schedule over the past month or so. Plus, it's kind of been a crazy month in terms of vacation, work, things like that, trying to get ready for season 3, kind of going through this mental reset, just to make sure that I myself am not going through the motions when I do these episodes, and that I don't lose the fire that I have for these topics, because they're very, very interesting to me. They hold a very near and dear place to my heart. Of course, if they didn't, I wouldn't be doing this, but I just wanted to let you know I appreciate y'all's patience with me and getting these episodes out as best as I can, putting my best foot forward for you all in terms of putting out episodes week after week. But again, I appreciate you tuning into this week's episode over Porphryios, the whale. If you like this topic, if you'd like me to do more historical kind of monsters and cryptids, please let me know. But other than that, I greatly appreciate you tuning in, and I will see you all on the next one.